In the heart of a quiet suburban town, a legal storm was brewing that would change a little boy's life forever. John, a 6-year-old child with big brown eyes and a soft, innocent smile, found himself caught between two worlds: the world of his mother, Lisa, and the world of his father, Mark. The custody battle that was about to unfold in court would leave everyone in the room stunned, especially John. The courtroom was tense, as both parents sat across from each other, their eyes filled with emotion. The judge, an experienced man in his late 50s, sat at the head of the room, his gavel resting calmly beside him. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward the parents. Lisa, Mark, the judge began, his voice steady but authoritative. We are here today to determine the custody arrangement for John. Lisa, would you like to begin? Lisa stood up, smoothing her blouse, her voice quivering slightly but steady enough to make her case. Yes, Your Honor, she began. I believe I am the best parent for John. I have been his primary caregiver since birth. I've given him everything he needs and have always put him first in my life. Mark, on the other hand, has been mostly absent. He prioritizes his work over our family. He's rarely around, and when he is, it doesn't take responsibility for his role as a father. Mark's jaw clenched as he stood to respond. His hands gripped the edge of the table, and he took a deep breath before speaking. Your Honor, Mark said, his voice calm but firm, I dispute that claim. I may have had a demanding work schedule, but I have always ensured that John is well taken care of. I spent time with him when I could. I read him stories, took him to the park, and tried to be there for him as much as possible. I love my son deeply. Lisa shook her head, clearly frustrated. That's not true. He's never around. He's always working, and when he is, he's distant and disengaged. How can you say you're a good father when you haven't been there for him when he needed you? The judge, still calm, watched the exchange between the two parents with sharp eyes. He made notes on his legal pad, but it was clear that neither parent was willing to back down. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Friends and family, who had come to witness the hearing, exchanged quiet whispers. Everyone knew this was not going to be an easy decision. Finally, after a long pause, the judge spoke again. Thank you both for your statements. Before we proceed further, I would like to hear from John himself. There was a collective gasp as everyone turned toward John, who was sitting quietly beside his lawyer. He was small for his age, clutching his beloved teddy bear tightly to his chest. His innocent eyes scanned the room nervously, his small figure seeming out of place in the formal setting of the courtroom. John, can you come here, please? The judge asked, his voice gentle and kind. He gestured toward the witness stand, and with a hesitant but determined step, John slowly walked to the front of the room. John's small legs were barely able to reach the chair at the witness stand, but the judge kindly helped him settle in. His heart was racing, and his hands shook as he gripped the teddy bear even tighter. John, the judge said softly, leaning down to make eye contact with him. How are you feeling today? I'm okay, I guess, John whispered, his voice barely audible. I understand this might be a little scary for you, but I just want to ask you a few questions. The judge continued, his tone soothing. Can you tell me about your time with your mommy and daddy? What's it like when you're with them? John looked down at his teddy bear for a long moment, as if he were trying to find the right words. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. His voice was soft but clear. I love both my mommy and daddy, he said, but he hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously between his parents. But mommy is lying. The entire courtroom fell silent. Lisa's face drained of color, and Mark's eyes widened in shock. No one had expected this. The tension in the room escalated as the judge tried to process what John had just said. John, the judge said gently, what do you mean by that? Can you explain what you mean? John looked down at his teddy bear again, clutching it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His voice trembled as he spoke, but he managed to get the words out. Mommy tells me to say things about daddy that aren't true, John said softly. She says if I don't say them, I won't get any more toys or ice cream. But I love my daddy. He reads me stories, and he takes me to the park. He isn't like mommy says he is. The room was dead silent, every eye fixed on John. Even the judge was momentarily taken aback. Lisa's face flushed with anger and panic, and she stood up abruptly, her voice sharp. John, what are you saying? Lisa cried. That's not true. That's not what happened. Order in the court, the judge called out, slamming his gavel down. Lisa, let John speak. John's voice quivered as he continued, his small body seeming to shrink in the presence of his mother's anger. I don't want to lie about daddy anymore, John said, his voice barely a whisper. I just want to be happy with both of them. The judge's expression became serious as the murmurs of shock and disbelief spread through the courtroom. Everyone was in disbelief. No one had expected this young boy to reveal such a truth. The judge looked down at his notes, then back up at the parents, his voice firm. Lisa, is there any truth to what John has said? The judge asked, his eyes steady and intense. Lisa was visibly shaking now, but she tried to compose herself. I was just trying to protect him, Lisa stammered. I thought it was best for him to be with me. I never meant to harm him. The judge paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. It is never in a child's best interest to be manipulated or used as a pawn, the judge said, his voice stern. John's testimony changes everything. The courtroom was in an uproar as the judge ordered a brief recess, signaling that the case would continue, but the path forward had shifted. The silence that hung in the courtroom after John's words was almost suffocating. The judge, his gavel still resting heavily in his hand, glanced over at Lisa, whose face had drained of color, her hands trembling at her sides. Mark, though visibly shocked, seemed to hold himself together, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But it was John, the little boy, who had just turned the world upside down with his words. Mommy is lying. John's voice still echoed in the judge's mind. The courtroom, a place usually filled with the weight of legal arguments and formal proceedings, had been rocked by the innocence of a child's truth. The judge cleared his throat and motioned for order. We need to proceed carefully from here, he said, his voice low but authoritative. John, can you tell me more about what you meant? You're safe here. You can tell me anything. John, still clutching his teddy bear tightly, shifted in his seat. His eyes were white with fear, but there was a spark of determination in his gaze. He wanted to make things right, to make sure the truth was known. Mommy tells me to say things about Daddy, things that aren't true, John said, his voice barely above a whisper, but steady. She says if I don't say them, I won't get any more toys or ice cream. His hands were tightly clasped around the bear's worn fabric, as though it were the only thing holding him steady. But I love my daddy, he continued. He reads me stories, and he takes me to the park. He's not bad like Mommy says. The courtroom was still. Lisa had turned her face away, as though the words stung too much to bear. Mark was silent, his eyes searching his son's face, as if trying to piece together what he had just heard. The judge, who had been scribbling notes, now raised his gaze. John, he began slowly, why do you think your mommy wants you to say these things about your daddy? John hesitated. He glanced briefly at his mother, who was now standing rigidly by her side, her lips pressed tightly together, her gaze fixed on the floor. But it was clear she was no longer holding the power in this room. John looked at the judge and spoke again, this time with more clarity. She says it's because I have to live with her, John explained, his voice soft but honest. She says if I don't say the things about Daddy, she won't let me stay with her, and I have to stay with Daddy. He paused, his voice cracking just slightly, before continuing, but I want to be with both of them. I don't want to choose. The judge sat her back, a serious expression crossing his face. It was clear that this was not just a child's simple misunderstanding, but a cry for help. The manipulation John spoke of wasn't subtle. It was direct, cruel, and meant to force him into a corner. Lisa's breath hitched as she stood by her attorney. She had been hoping to maintain control, to guide the narrative in her favor, but now, with John's testimony, her grip on the situation was slipping away. Order in the court, the judge called out firmly, bringing the room back into focus. Lisa, I need you to remain seated and allow John to speak freely, please. Lisa's hands were clenched at her sides, but she didn't say another word. She sat her down, but her face was flushed with anger, her jaw tight. John, on the other hand, seemed to relax a little, as if he had finally said what needed to be said. His voice was small, but there was a strength in it, a child's strength to speak the truth, despite the fear it might bring. John, the judge continued, thank you for being so brave. I know this isn't easy. Now, can you tell me, how do you feel when you're with your mommy and when you're with your daddy? John took a deep breath, his gaze shifting from his father to his mother. When I'm with mommy, I'm scared sometimes, he admitted. She gets mad if I don't say the right things. But when I'm with daddy, it's fun. We play, and he doesn't tell me what to say. He just lets me be me. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mark's heart ached as he watched his son speak the truth as truth so honestly, without any filter. It wasn't about blaming anyone. It was simply about the pain John had been carrying for who knew how long. His voice was so clear and untainted by any malice or anger. It was simply a child's honest perspective on the world he lived in. "Your Honor, I don't want to lie any more," John added quietly, his gaze now steady and sure. "I just want to be happy." The judge sat still for a moment, processing the weight of John's testimony. He looked toward Lisa, whose face was pale and unreadable. Then he turned to Mark, who had his eyes locked on his son, a look of concern mixed with relief. Mark had always known that something wasn't right, but hearing his son speak those words aloud made everything painfully clear. The judge took a deep breath, his hands resting on his desk. "This court will now take a recess to reassess the proceedings," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "A thorough investigation will be conducted to verify these claims. It is of utmost importance that John's best interests are prioritized, and we will ensure that this is done properly." As the courtroom emptied, whispers began to spread like wildfire. No one could quite believe what had just happened. A little boy had stepped forward, his voice shaking, yet strong enough to unravel a web of lies and manipulation that had been spent for far too long. But for John, the relief was palpable. His words had been heard, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: the truth had found its way into the light. And in that moment, he didn't have to choose sides. He was simply John's little boy who loved both his mommy and daddy, and who had finally found the courage to speak up. The courtroom doors closed behind them, and the weight of the revelation still hung in there. John, though small and vulnerable, had spoken the truth that many adults had either ignored or failed to see. His words echoed in the minds of everyone present, leaving an indelible mark on their hearts and minds. For Lisa and Mark, the battle for custody had just taken an unexpected and irreversible turn. John and Mark walked out of the courtroom together, the tension that had filled the room now replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable silence. John clutched his teddy bear tightly as they made their way to the exit. His steps were hesitant, but there was a certain relief in the way he held his father's hand. Mark looked down at his son, his heart breaking for what John had been through, but also swelling with pride for his courage. "John, you did something really brave today," Mark said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "You told the truth. I'm proud of you." John looked up at his father, his eyes wide, as if he were processing the weight of his words. "But will Mommy be mad at me now?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with worry. Mark squeezed his hand. "I'm not sure what will happen next, buddy, but you did the right thing, and no matter what, I'm always here for you." At that moment, the sound of the courthouse doors opening behind them interrupted the quiet conversation. Lisa, followed by her lawyer, walked briskly toward them. She had composed herself, but the strained look on her face betrayed the chaos she was feeling inside. Her eyes locked onto Mark and John, her expression unreadable. "Mark," she said sharply, her voice tight, "this isn't over." Mark's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "I know, Lisa, but we need to think about what's best for John, not what's best for us." Lisa's eyes flicked down to John, who was standing close to Mark, still holding his teddy bear, her face twisted with a mix of frustration and guilt, but she said nothing more. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving father and son standing in the hallway, uncertain of what the future held. The next few weeks were a blur of investigations, interviews, and tense meetings. The judge's ruling for a thorough investigation into John's living situation had set a series of events into motion. Social workers were assigned to monitor both homes, conducting unannounced visits to ensure John was safe and well cared for. It was clear that the truth of the courtroom testimony had set the stage for a deeper look into the family's dynamics. At Mark's home, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The social workers observed the lively interactions between father and son. Mark and John spent their days together playing, reading, and enjoying each other's company. Mark's home, though modest, was filled with love and care. John seemed genuinely happy. They were laughing, playing, and opening up in a way that social workers rarely saw in children of his age. During one of their visits, the social worker sat her down with John, asking questions about his time with his father. "John, how do you feel when you're at your daddy's house?" the social worker asked gently, taking notes. "I feel happy," John replied, his small face lighting up as he spoke. "We play catch, and he reads me stories. I like being with him." The social worker smiled, noting the joy in John's words. "And when you're at your mommy's house, how do you feel?" John hesitated, his expression shifting slightly. He looked down at his teddy bear, the one that had been with him through all of this. "It's okay, I guess, but sometimes Mommy gets mad, if I don't say the right things. She tells me what to say, and it makes me scared." The social worker nodded, making more notes. "What kind of things does she tell you to say?" John's voice lowered as he looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "She says that Daddy's bad, and that I shouldn't like him. She says if I say the wrong thing, I won't get any toys or treats." His voice faltered. "But I like my toys. I don't want to stop getting them." The social worker placed a comforting hand on John's shoulder. "It's okay, John. You're doing the right thing by telling us the truth." At that moment, the social worker's heart broke for the little boy sitting before her. The signs of manipulation were undeniable. My child, caught in the middle of his parents' battle, had been coerced into aligning with his mother out of fear. But now, his bravery in speaking up would start to reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long. Meanwhile, at Lisa's house, the atmosphere was different. The social workers noted the tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the home. Lisa's interactions with John were strained, and during their visits, there was always an undercurrent of pressure. Lisa was often overheard, giving John directives on how to behave, what to say, and how to respond. The child seemed quieter here, less animated, as though he was holding his breath, unsure of what might happen if he said the wrong thing. One social worker, upon observing Lisa's behavior, made a note in their report. "There is a marked difference between the two environments. John seems much more relaxed and comfortable in his father's home. In contrast, at his mother's house, there is an ongoing sense of tension, as though John is constantly walking on eggshells." During one of the interviews, the social worker asked Lisa about her relationship with John. Her response was defensive, almost rehearsed. "I do what's best for my son," Lisa stated, her voice tight. "I want him to grow up in a safe environment, and I believe that's with me. Mark isn't reliable. He doesn't care about John the way I do. I'm the one who's always there for him." The social worker nodded, but there was no mistaking the lack of warmth in Lisa's words. It was clear that her version of what was best for John was being distorted by her desire to win the custody battle at any cost. As the days passed, the reports began to pile up. Teachers, neighbors, and even close friends were interviewed, each one offering more pieces of the puzzle. The teacher at John's school spoke of his frequent reluctance to talk about his weekends with his mother, while neighbors commented on how Lisa had kept John isolated from other children, unlike Mark, who encouraged playdates and outdoor activities. The evidence was mounting, and it was becoming clear that the real issue was not about who loved John. More it was about who was willing to manipulate him for their own gain. With every report and testimony, the truth began to take shape. Lisa's actions had not only undermined her relationship with her son, but had caused emotional harm that could take years to heal. Mark, on the other hand, had proven himself as a loving and responsible father, dedicated to his son's happiness and well-being. And as the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, it became increasingly clear that the custody arrangement would soon be reevaluated. The days after the social workers' visits passed slowly for Mark and John. The waiting was the hardest part. While John seemed to relax a little more at his father's house, his mind still lingered on the things he'd said in court, things he'd revealed about his mother. Mark could sense that his son, though relieved by the truth, was still processing everything that had happened. For Mark, the burden of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had been trying to keep things as normal as possible for John, but it was clear that their lives would never be the same. Still, he remained hopeful. He believed that the truth was on his side, that John would be allowed to live in an environment where he could grow up free from manipulation and fear. But as the court date loomed closer, the uncertainty hung over them both like a dark cloud. The courtroom was once again packed when the day of the final hearing arrived. The air was thick with tension. Lisa sat with her lawyer, her posture rigid and unyielding. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, but there was an unmistakable flicker of panic in her gaze. Mark, on the other hand, seemed calm, though his nerves were simmering beneath the surface. His hand rested protectively on John's shoulder, and John, holding his teddy bear as always, looked around the room nervously. The judge entered the courtroom, and the room immediately fell silent. With a firm tap of his gavel, the proceedings began. "Thank you all for your patience," the judge began, his voice steady. "We are here today to finalize the custody arrangements for young John. Over the course of the past few weeks, this court has conducted a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding this case. The findings are now ready to be presented." There was a slight shift in the courtroom as all eyes turned to the judge. Mark glanced at his lawyer, who gave him a reassuring nod. Lisa's lawyer, however, appeared more on edge, glancing quickly at Lisa before turning his attention back to the proceedings. Before we proceed with my ruling, the judge continued, I would like to offer both parties one final opportunity to speak. Lisa's lawyer stood first, addressing the court. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the concerns raised in this case, I ask that you consider the intentions behind Lisa's actions. She is a mother who, out of love and concern for her son, acted in what she believed to be his best interest. It is clear that she has always been dedicated to providing a safe and secure home for John. Lisa's eyes flickered with a hint of hope, as though this was the moment her lawyer was preparing to turn the tide in her favor. But Mark wasn't fooled. He had seen too much to believe that Lisa's words were genuine. The judge nodded, acknowledging the statement, but then motioned for Mark's lawyer to speak. Your Honor, while Lisa may have had good intentions at one time, the evidence clearly shows that her actions have gone far beyond simply protecting her son. The social worker's reports have documented a pattern of behavior that suggests manipulation and coercion, causing significant emotional distress for John. We cannot ignore the toll this has taken on him, nor can we allow it to continue. Mark has proven himself to be a loving, caring, and responsible father, committed to John's well-being. Without resorting to manipulation or fear, we ask that primary custody be granted to Mark. The judge nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving between Lisa, Mark, and John. Thank you, he said, his tone measured. Now, I would like to hear from John once again. He is, after all, the one most affected by this decision. John's heart raced as he was called up to the witness stand once more. His legs felt like jelly as he walked up to the front of the courtroom, still clutching his beloved teddy bear. Mark's hand rested on his back as he guided him to the stand, and John took a seat, looking up at the judge with wide, uncertain eyes. John, the judge said kindly, I know this is hard for you, but I need you to tell me how you feel. You've been very brave already, and I just want to make sure that we're doing what's best for you. How do you feel now? John took a deep breath, looking down at his teddy bear for a moment as he tried to collect his thoughts. Finally, he looked up, his voice clear and steady, though still tinged with nerves. I just want to be happy, John said softly. I don't want to pick. I love both my mommy and daddy, but I don't want to lie anymore. I want to be able to spend time with both of them without feeling scared. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. John's words were simple but powerful, and they cut through the legal jargon and arguments that had filled the courtroom. In that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room John wasn't just a pawn in his parents' battle. He was a child with hopes and fears of his own, and had deserved the right to be heard. The judge leaned forward, his expression softening as he took in John's words. Thank you, John. You've done the right thing by speaking up. Your words will help guide this court to make the best decision for you. John smiled faintly, relief washing over him. It wasn't as if the decision had already been made, but somehow, it felt like a weight had been lifted from his small shoulders. He had told the truth, and that was all he could do. The judge turned to Lisa, his expression now serious. Lisa, you've heard your son's testimony. I trust you understand the gravity of the situation. Your actions have caused him unnecessary distress, and it is clear that this court must prioritize his well-being above all else. Lisa's face twisted with emotion, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. I didn't mean to hurt him. I love him, she protested, her voice breaking. The judge gave her a measured look. I understand that, but your actions have not reflected that love in the way they should. Manipulating a child to further your own desires is not an act of love, and it cannot continue. There was a long pause, and the courtroom waited with bated breath as the judge prepared to make his decision. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke, his voice steady but resolute. In light of the evidence presented and the testimony of both the parents and the child, I have no choice but to make a difficult decision. The court has determined that primary custody of John will be granted to Mark, with Lisa's visitation rights to be supervised for the time being. This decision will be reevaluated in 6 months, but for now, it is clear that John needs a stable and nurturing environment, free from manipulation. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes as the weight of the decision settled over him. He looked at John, whose face lit up with a shy smile, as if the world had just become a little brighter. For Lisa, the news was a bitter pill to swallow. Her head dropped, and for the first time in the entire court battle, she seemed to realize the full extent of what her actions had caused her. It wasn't just about losing the battle for custody, it was about losing her son's trust. As the courtroom began to empty, Mark stood with John, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be more battles to fight, but for now, in that moment, they had won. The weeks following the judge's ruling were a mix of relief and trepidation. For Mark and John, the change was overwhelming, but they both knew that it was a necessary one. Mark's heart swelled with gratitude that his son was now officially in his care, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the battle was far from over. There were still scars to heal, both emotional and psychological, and he knew it would take time for John to fully adjust to the new reality. At first, John seemed lighter. He no longer had to tiptoe around his mother's demands, and he could simply enjoy time with his father, without the looming pressure of false accusations or manipulations. Mark noticed that John smiled more often, laughed a little louder, and even started talking more freely about the activities he enjoyed. The weekends were filled with trips to the park, movie nights, and long walks through the woods. It was a far cry from the tense, controlled environment John had grown accustomed to at his mother's house. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. John would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night, his small body trembling with anxiety. He would call out for his mother, even though he had no intention of leaving Mark's side. His dreams, filled with fragmented memories of the chaos he'd experienced, would sometimes cause him to lash out, unsure of where to direct his confusion and pain. Mark, ever patient, would sit by his side, gently stroking his hair, whispering calming words, until John fell back into a peaceful sleep. One evening, after such a restless night, John sat on the couch, hugging his teddy bear tightly to his chest. Mark had just returned from picking him up from one of Lisa's supervised visits. John had been quiet during the ride home. Lost in his thoughts, Mark could tell that something was weighing on his son's heart. "Hey, buddy," Mark said gently, sitting next to him. "How was your time with Mommy today?" John didn't look up immediately, but after a long pause, he spoke in a soft voice. "It's always the same," he said, his eyes downcast. "She says I have to say that Daddy's bad if I want to get my toys, and if I don't, she gets upset." Mark's heart clenched at the words. He had hoped that, with the change in custody, the manipulative behavior would stop, but it seemed like Lisa wasn't ready to let go of the control she had exerted over John, even though she had lost the battle in court. Mark took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew it wasn't easy for John to navigate this new reality, especially with his mother still trying to manipulate him, despite the court's decision. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to, John," Mark said firmly, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're safe here, and no one will ever make you lie about me. You understand that, right?" John nodded, though his eyes remained sad. "I just don't want to make Mommy sad," he said quietly. Mark smiled softly and pulled his son into a hug. "You're not responsible for making Mommy happy. You're only responsible for being the best you can be. I'll always be proud of you, no matter what." The words seemed to comfort John, but the unease was still there, lingering. Mark knew it was going to take time for John to feel completely safe and free from the psychological toll Lisa had imposed on him. There would be setbacks, moments when John would struggle with loyalty and guilt, torn between his love for both parents. Meanwhile, Lisa's life outside of the courtroom was crumbling. The weight of her actions had begun to take a toll on her, and she found herself isolated, both emotionally and socially. Her friends, who had once rallied behind her during the divorce, began to distance themselves as they saw the extent of her manipulative behavior. She had lost her support system, and her relationship with John was fractured beyond repair. Lisa's visits to the therapist were becoming more frequent, but even the counselor couldn't ignore the reality of her actions. In the silence of the therapy room, Lisa would admit that she had tried to control John, to force him into the role of the victim in the narrative she had constructed in her mind. But she didn't seem to fully understand the damage she had caused. She clung to the hope that, somehow, she could still reclaim what she had lost. Her therapist, however, was adamant. "Lisa, it's important to understand that your actions have had consequences, not just for you, but for John as well. Manipulating him, forcing him to choose sides, to lie about his father will have lasting effects on his emotional development. If you want to rebuild your relationship with him, you have to start by being honest with yourself and with him." Lisa's face twisted with frustration. "I just want him to be with me. Why can't he see that I'm the one who loves him more?" The therapist's expression softened. "It's not about love, Lisa. It's about trust, and trust is something you've broken. Rebuilding that trust will take time, and it starts with you acknowledging the hurt you caused and taking responsibility for it. Lisa didn't have the answers, and the therapist's words left her feeling even more lost than before, but deep down, she knew it was true. She had pushed John away in her attempts to control him, and now she was reaping the consequences. As the weeks turned into months, Mark continued to focus on providing a stable, loving environment for John. The little victories, though small, were enough to keep his hope alive. John's laughter became more frequent, and he began to open up about his feelings without the same hesitation. He started talking about his friends at school, his favorite activities, and the things he dreamed about for the future. It was clear that the weight he had been carrying was slowly lifting. But there were still hard days ahead. John would sometimes retreat into silence, his eyes distant as he thought about the times he had spent with Lisa, and Mark, despite his own relief and newfound peace, had to remind himself that this was not a simple fix. The damage done to John's psyche couldn't be erased overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of love. One night, as Mark and John sat together on the couch, watching a movie, John spoke up. "Daddy, do you think Mommy will ever change?" Mark paused the movie and turned to look at his son. The question was heavy, and Mark could see the uncertainty in John's eyes. "I don't know, buddy," Mark replied honestly. "I think she has to want to change, but no matter what happens, you don't have to worry about it. You're here with me now, and I'll always take care of you." John nodded, his face relaxing as he rested his head on Mark's shoulder. The simple gesture, a sign of comfort and trust, was a victory in itself. For Mark, the journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, both legal and emotional. But as he sat there with John, he realized that they were no longer just fighting for custody. They were fighting for healing, for a future where John could grow up free from fear and manipulation. And in that moment, Mark knew they were on the right path. Months passed since the court ruling, and while Mark had hoped for a smooth transition, the process of healing for John was more complicated than he had anticipated. Despite the relief of living with his father, John still wrestled with the emotional scars left by his mother's manipulation. The once carefree child was now cautious, still uncertain of the world around him. His emotional journey was just beginning, and Mark knew it would take more than time to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. John had come a long way since the courtroom drama. He was more confident now, no longer carrying the heavy burden of being forced to lie or choose sides. But every now and then, the old fears would resurface, and Mark would notice the subtle changes: John becoming quiet or withdrawing. When things became too overwhelming, Mark was patient, always ready to listen, always willing to provide the comfort John needed. One afternoon, after returning from a visit with Lisa still under supervision, John seemed unusually quiet. Mark noticed the way he hung his head, his teddy bear clutched tightly in his arms as if it were his only source of comfort. Mark sat beside him on the couch, his heart aching as he watched his son struggle to express what he was feeling. "Hey, buddy," Mark said gently, turning to face him. "How was today?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the floor, his fingers nervously twisting the seams of his shirt. Mark waited, giving him the time and space he needed. Finally, John looked up, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "Mommy said I'm a bad boy," John whispered. "She says I'm making things worse." Mark's chest tightened, his heart broke for his son. He knew that Lisa wasn't ready to accept responsibility for the damage she'd caused. She was still holding on to the hope that somehow John could be manipulated back into her life as if nothing had happened. Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't want to dismiss John's feelings or make light of the situation, but he also needed to remind him of the truth. "John," Mark said softly, turning his son to face him, "you're not a bad boy. Not now. Not ever. What happened wasn't your fault. You didn't cause any of this. Sometimes, people like Mommy say things that aren't true, especially when they're scared or confused. But you know what's real, right?" John nodded slowly, his eyes searching his father's face. Mark smiled warmly, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "You know the truth. John, you are an amazing kid. You're strong, and you're brave, and I'm so proud of you for telling the truth in court. I know it wasn't easy, but you did it. You helped make everything better, not just for you, but for both of us. And we're going to be okay, I promise." John's eyes brightened a little, and for the first time in days, he smiled. It was small, but it was a start. "I know, Daddy. I like it here. I like being with you." Mark wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close. "And I like being with you, buddy. We're going to take things one day at a time, okay? but we'll get through this together, you and me. As time went on, the healing process continued for John, though it wasn't without its setbacks. He began therapy, where he could talk about his feelings in a safe and supportive space. The therapist was kind and understanding, giving him the tools he needed to express his emotions without fear of judgment. Slowly, John began to open up, sharing more of his inner world and processing the trauma that had been inflicted on him. Mark was there every step of the way, offering his unconditional support. He took time off work to attend therapy sessions with John, ensuring his son never felt alone in the process. And little by little, John's laughter began to fill their home again. The playful moments, the joy of shared experiences, and the feeling of safety and stability started to return. Meanwhile, Lisa's relationship with John remained strained, despite her insistence that she was trying to change. The damage done was too great to heal overnight. She continued to have supervised visits, but John remained distant, often retreating into himself during their time together. He didn't trust her any more in the way he once had, and though Lisa tried to be patient, her guilt and frustration were evident. She didn't know how to undo the harm she had caused, and it seemed that every attempt only pushed John further away. One day, after a particularly difficult visit, Lisa called Mark. Her voice was shaky, and for the first time in a long while, there was a tone of vulnerability in it. "I don't know what to do anymore," Lisa confessed. "He won't talk to me. He won't even look at me. I've tried everything, but I just can't reach him." Mark listened carefully, his own feelings a mix of anger and pity. Lisa had created this situation, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. But at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a faint spark of sympathy for her. She had lost the trust of the one person who had once meant everything to her, and now she was left with a broken relationship that couldn't be fixed with empty words or promises. "Lisa," Mark said quietly, "it's going to take time, and you have to stop expecting him to forgive you right away. He's been hurt. Trust is something that's built over time, not something that can be rushed. If you want to repair things with him, you have to show him through your actions it just works, that you're someone he can trust again." Lisa's silence on the other end of the phone was heavy. Mark could hear the weight of her realization in it. "I just want him back," she said, almost pleading. "I know," Mark replied, his voice steady, "but it's not just about getting him back. It's about earning his trust, and that starts with respecting his feelings, accepting the truth of what happened, and giving him the space to heal." As the months continued to pass, Mark and John settled into a new rhythm of life. They had their ups and downs, but they were stronger together. John had learned to navigate the complexities of his emotions, and with Mark's steady support, he was growing into a more confident, secure child. Mark was proud of the progress John had made, and as they stood side by side, facing whatever challenges the future might hold, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The healing was far from complete, and there would be more hurdles to overcome, but Mark was no longer afraid. He had his son's trust, his love on. Together, they would build a future grounded in honesty, love, and the unbreakable bond they had forged in the face of adversity. And so, they continued forward, with the understanding that while the past would always be a part of them, it no longer defined who they were. They were creating their own story now, only of resilience, truth, and the power of starting anew. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. Have a wonderful day.